Right, Bonnie Glazer is a senior advisor for Asia and the director of the China Power Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And that kind of rolls off my tongue, the China Power Project. What is that?
Well, it is a data-driven website to evaluate how China's power is evolving relative, of course, to other countries in key areas pertaining to economics, technology, military, international image, and social or soft power.
All right, Bonnie is just not another kind of think tank person, because when I read back through your resume, Bonnie, you've been doing this for a couple of decades at least, and you understand China very well.
Well, I think those of us who have studied China for decades know there is more that we do not know than we do know. You certainly can't go to China once as a tourist and be an expert. And there's so much in China that is opaque, very much a black box, especially under Xi Jinping. So it's always a challenge to figure out what underlies China's policies.
You've advised the US government in the past. Would you advise them right now that they're doing a smart thing with regard to Taiwan? Increased arms sales, diplomatic visits. It's escalating, isn't it?
Yes, I think that the United States has a lot at stake with Taiwan. And frankly, I believe that the president of Taiwan is not pursuing provocative measures, and the Chinese are putting enormous diplomatic and military pressure on her and her government. And so then the question is, what does the US really need to do in response? Because we don't want to have a military conflict across the strait. And we don't want Taiwan to be intimidated or the people to feel that they have to succumb to China's demands when in fact that is not what they choose to do. And this is a hard set of challenges for the US government. So I support many things that the Trump administration is doing. We do have an obligation under the Taiwan Relations Act to sell arms. Sometimes we sell things that are appropriate. Other times we do not. I personally think that spending billions of dollars on tanks was not a good way for Taiwan to spend its very precious defense dollars. But there's about to be a new package of arms sold to Taiwan that will really focus more on asymmetrical capabilities, things like sea mines, coastal defense cruise missiles.
Right, 7 major weapon systems, mines, cruise missiles, drones. I mean, the thing is, though, in the past, the US has kind of dribbled in weapon supplies to Taiwan. This is much more overt. This is a much bigger package this time. And is that designed to kind of tell China, look, don't mess with Taiwan?
No, I don't really think so. I think actually the dribble approach is the right one. In other words, Taiwan should be treated like every other country that purchases arms from the United States. When they make a request, we should evaluate it and give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Really no need to accumulate large packages. We should just take them as they are submitted. So frankly, I think that is the better approach. But what the signaling we're doing toward Taiwan is more in terms of US military exercises. We've seen US bombers in the area. We've seen an increase in US naval activity. But we are also, in a sense, provoking China and the sending of high-level US officials, which personally I support. The Chinese have seen as a real threat to their sovereignty. So part of the problem is that there's really no dialogue going on at the moment.
Why would you support provoking them?
Well, it's their perception that we're provoking them. I'm not sure that I believe that it should be seen as a provocation. So I think there's nothing wrong with sending the US Health and Human Secretary to Taiwan. I mean, Taiwan has had about 400 cases of COVID and 7 deaths. They are an exemplary model for the rest of the world, boy, the United States could learn a lot from them. So why not send our, health and human secretary to Taiwan? But what I was just going to say is that I think that it's the absence of dialogue that makes this very dangerous. And there's no real dialogue between the US and China on these issues. Conflict prevention and management, and there's really no conversations between China and Taiwan either.
You know, when you talk about dialogue, though, I would think that normally you have a conflict, you have dialogue, and you move towards resolution. The whole ability to keep peace with Taiwan and China for 40 years and more would be that you simply don't address the issue, and you keep it vague. And that seems that status quo of murky smoke and mirrors has kind of kept peace between China and Taiwan, because the US has a one China policy. And I'm not even sure what that means. Maybe you can define it for me. It's independent. It's not independent. Where are we now?
Well, the US does not take a position on who has sovereignty over Taiwan. So it doesn't recognize Taiwan's claim to sovereignty, nor does it recognize the PRC claim. And the one China policy is essentially that Beijing represents China in the international community. But if we go back to the language of the Shanghai Communique, the United States acknowledged China's claim over Taiwan, but it did not recognize that claim. And this is a difference between Beijing and Washington today.
All right. So anybody who doesn't understand this, because I know you've lived with it for a long time, that sounds confusing. And I think it's meant to be a little confusing. And that is Ronald Reagan gave 6 assurances to Taiwan in 1982. And that was recently declassified, right? I haven't read the documents, but it was recently declassified. And everybody says that reportedly there is a very clear commitment to defend Taiwan against an attack by China, correct?
No, the 6 assurances.
Straighten me out.
The 6 assurances do not pertain to a promise to attack, to defend Taiwan if attacked.
Were there subsequent promises to that?
No. In fact, under the Taiwan Relations Act, the United States does not have an ironclad commitment to Taiwan to defend it. This is something that would be left up to the president and the Congress if there were to be an attack on Taiwan. And so there are people now who are advocating, both experts and members of Congress, that we should abandon what is often referred to as strategic ambiguity. In other words, not making clear whether we would come to Taiwan's defense, and adopt a position of strategic clarity. So some people think changing that declaratory policy and giving the president an advance authority to send troops if China is attacked, that will deter China. But the problem is that the US military capabilities are really weakened right now in terms of intervening on Taiwan's behalf. So I think that changing our declaratory policy in the absence of bolstering US military capabilities is potentially dangerous and could provoke the attack that we seek to prevent.
Somebody says that, if the US were to seriously want to support Taiwan in an invasion, I mean, you're talking about at least 4 divisions, some 80,000, a commitment of 80,000 troops. This is no small conflict that would draw in US Navy and the Air Force and then boots on the ground in terms of the US Army.
Well, it's hard to know how quickly such a conflict would escalate, but it certainly would start out as a naval conflict, and Taiwan would seek to hold out long enough for a sufficient amount of US troops to arrive, and that would probably take months. The US would initially flow forces from what we have deployed in the region, of course, primarily in Japan. and perhaps from Guam, but then also from continental US, it could become a very large-scale conflict, and it's one that I think everybody hopes to avoid.
Do you think China is serious about taking over Taiwan and before this president leaves the Communist Party? Because China's president has said over and over again that he doesn't think they should it should not be kept passing through generation to generation to generation.
Well, I think that Xi Jinping's statement, which he has made twice, that it shouldn't be passed down from generation to the next, is that does indicate at least some impatience. But I don't think that indicates urgency. For the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping must say that unification is inevitable. And he has talked about national rejuvenation, which he calls, the Chinese dream that should be achieved by 2049. He has said that should include unification with Taiwan. Now, he won't be alive then, so we don't know whether he will actually try to achieve this in his lifetime. But his rhetorical statements, of course, must be that this is a sovereignty issue for China and that Taiwan belongs to China. But I think that Xi Jinping has other priorities that are more urgent, that he would not want to put at risk at this particular moment. So if backed into a corner, if he feels that his own position, the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party is in jeopardy, then perhaps he would act. So I don't rule out that he would, but I think that his preference is still to try to resolve the differences with Taiwan peacefully. And he has not abandoned the strategy essentially that he inherited from Hu Jintao, which is peaceful development across the Taiwan Strait. And he continues to speak about peaceful reunification, even though, of course, he does not rule out the use of force. So if the US and Taiwan are not careful, perhaps they could provoke the reaction from China that they seek to avoid. So it is difficult to determine what will deter Beijing and what will provoke it. And there are differences on those questions.
What is the point of sending warplanes from China across the Taiwan Strait, that 80-mile nautical mile stretch of water that they've been doing very recently, sending tens of warplanes approaching Taiwan and saying that they don't even recognize a middle of the strait?
Well, certainly the PRC has never recognized the median line of the strait, which was drawn so many decades ago by the United States, but they have tacitly acknowledged it for many years. In the 1990s, when Taiwan President Lee Teng-hui he gave a speech at Cornell University, and Beijing thought that he was pushing for independence, and they flew dozens of fighters across the center line then. And the situation was quiet for 20 years. And in March of 2019, China started again. And I believe this past week was the 5th time.
Because of the change of leadership in Taiwan. I mean, the race for what appears to be independence now, and you have generations of.
Well, appears to who to be independence. I can give you lots of examples of actions that President Tsai Ing-wen has taken to try and tamp down tensions and to discourage radical elements of her own party from pushing for independence.
But she ran on an independence platform, didn't she?
Her party has had an independence platform in the past.
You think she's more moderate?
I do think she's more moderate. I think she's very prudent.
Do you, just to wrap this up, take this back to your own politics, as you rapidly approach the November election, do you see a distinct difference between a President Trump administration and a Democrat President Biden in terms of the way they'll deal with Taiwan, one more aggressively, one less, or how do you see it?
Well, I would highlight one potential difference, and this is, of course, my own personal view. But I think that a Biden administration would also want to strengthen deterrence and prevent war. And they would want to strengthen the US-Taiwan relationship. But I think that they would go back to doing things in a more quiet way. And we have seen this in many administrations in the past, where we sail, of course, naval ships through the Taiwan Strait, but it's only under the Trump administration that this was made public. We have high-level meetings with officials from Taiwan, but we don't necessarily make them public. So I think that there might be an effort just to go back to doing things a little bit more quietly so that we don't seem to be humiliating Xi Jinping and pushing him into a corner and perhaps forcing him to make a decision that he doesn't want to make. But I also think that the Biden administration will try to resume dialogue with China at many levels to talk about how we can avoid miscalculation and crisis.
You
But I
see a
think,
more dangerous situation, it seems, if President Trump wins re-election.
well, I think that it is potentially dangerous right now. And I'm quite worried about the situation between now and the US election and then the inauguration of the next president. And I think that that is the dangerous time. But I would say also that if elected, that I think President Biden would be a firm supporter for Taiwan, for the values that we share, and for its role in the international community. And that would be consistent with prior Democratic presidents as well.
Are you more worried? I promise it's the last question, Bonnie. Are you more worried now? You're wiser and you've studied this a long time, but times have changed. China seems to be more aggressive. We've seen what's going on in Hong Kong. The US under Trump is much more outspoken with regard to Taiwan and more overt. Are you more concerned now than you've ever been in terms of a possible conflict between Taiwan and China?
Yes, I am. I think that the combination of PRC capabilities militarily, Xi Jinping is a very aggressive leader who is less risk averse than his predecessors. Certainly a more overt level of support from the United States for Taiwan. And yet the factor that is perhaps least worrisome to me is actually Taiwan's policies itself. And in the past, when we've had a risk of conflict at times, and like when Chen Shui-bian was president, Taiwan was seen as the provocateur. So the dynamics are quite different today.
Bonnie Glaser, at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Terrific to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.